This is lecture 32 on the later Crusades for ancient and medieval worlds. This is part one. We've looked at the first three Crusades, the ones that created the Crusader principalities of Outremer, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the desperate attempts to stave off the destruction of those states with the Second and Third Crusades. Now, the only way the First Crusade had managed to succeed was that the Muslims of the area were divided, both politically and religiously. Saladin had united Muslim-controlled Syria and Egypt and managed to emphasize the importance of reclaiming lost Muslim territories, which had not actually been a really big deal among Muslims in the first generation after the Crusades had happened. Most Muslims had seen their fellow Muslims of different faiths as their principal rivals, not the Crusaders, or actually even sometimes fellow Muslims of their own faith. They had been fundamentally divided. That is what had allowed the Crusaders to succeed and to survive until the time of Saladin. Now, Richard the Lionheart, as we saw in the Third Crusade, had managed to secure the return of Outremer's port cities, the economic core of the Crusader states, but not Jerusalem itself, the religious objective. And so while Saladin's death shortly thereafter meant that Outremer was again safe as Syria and Egypt again became divided between Saladin's family members, there were going to have to be more crusades to reclaim the city of Jerusalem. This lecture is the story of how the idea of crusading went off track in the 1200s, leading to massive intra-Christian violence and then eventually to the destruction of Outremer. So the first part of this lecture in this video is going to cover the Fourth Crusade principally, with the attack of Western Crusaders on Eastern Christians in Constantinople. The second part of this lecture is going to cover a crusade solely within Europe, the Albigensian Crusade against heretics in southern France, along with the Fifth and Sixth Crusades led by Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was really more interested in fighting with the Pope than he was in actually going on crusade. And then finally, in the third part of this lecture, we're going to look at the last two numbered crusades, those led by the famous Saint Louis IX, the King of France, and how the dynasty of Mamluks rose to control the entire region of the Middle East around the Crusader states, and eventually, therefore, was able to finally bring them to an end in the 1290s. All right, so this first part of the lecture is going to be studying the Fourth Crusade. Arguably, the Fourth Crusade is the most important to history and indeed to the story of this class. It was called in 1198 by the new pope then, Innocent III. Probably the single most important pope in this class, and again, arguably the most important pope in the history of the papacy. Why? Well, we saw earlier that Innocent III had a major role in the development of Magna Carta in England. He had actually put an enormous amount of pressure on John, and this was part of what had led to John's complete fiasco with his own nobles that led to Magna Carta. We also saw, when I was discussing Innocent III more properly in his own context as an excellent papal monarch, that he had called the Fourth Lateran Council, which led to really important church reforms in the same year as Magna Carta 1215, that had solidified the central importance of the popes. But before any of these events, right at the start of Innocent III's pontificate, he called the Fourth Crusade. And the Fourth Crusade is incredibly controversial because, as we shall see, it went off the rails and ended up not retaking Jerusalem from the Muslims, but instead seizing Constantinople from their fellow Christians, with a new set of Crusader states far less successful taking root in Greece. This sealed the great schism that we looked at in an earlier lecture between the Western Latin Christians and the Eastern Greek-speaking Christians. And it marked the real beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire. Many Greeks have never forgiven Western Christians for this atrocity. This event is often blamed on the Italian city of Venice, which requires some background. Remember that the Italians figured very strongly into the story of Outremer, the Crusader states so far. It was they that had made the Crusader states viable economically, conducting the shipping trade between Outremer in the Levant and Western Europe. And this had made the Italian city-states, which it's important to keep in mind were not politically unified with each other, the Italian city-states had become so wealthy that individually some of the larger cities made more money than the monarchs of England or France. Venice was on the edge of Italy, at the edge of the western part of Europe. The Venetians thought of themselves as closely related to, but independent from, the Byzantines. They had a long relationship with the Byzantines as favored trading partners. Venice was a republic, mimicking the old Roman constitution very loosely, where the most powerful merchants elected their leader, called the Doge, which comes from the same Latin root as duke. Venice relied on trade, and it had a mini-empire of commercial ports that it controlled with its powerful navy, similar to several other major Italian city-states of the time, or, like we looked at very long ago back in the ancient part of this course, the Carthaginians, those rivals of the Roman Empire who had likewise controlled a mercantile empire of the seas. This is something which pops up repeatedly as an idea throughout history, and Venice was extremely good at this from about the time that we're looking at through well after the end of the Middle Ages. When Innocent III called the Fourth Crusade, he asked nobles rather than kings to lead it, in an attempt to recapture the success of the First Crusade, which, as we saw, was likewise not led by kings in the way that we saw happening with the Second and Third Crusades, which, of course, as we also saw, had not turned out. Now, these European nobles negotiated with Venice to transport them by ship, promising that every crusader would bring cash to pay the costs. Now, Venice put all of its shipping on hold for a year and a half and went to the enormous expense of refitting old ships and building new ones to carry all the promised crusaders, ready to head out in 1202. The problem was that only half the number of promised crusaders showed up, and that meant, since it was these crusaders that were supposed to be paying for this venture, that Venice was facing economic ruin. So the Doge of Venice worked out a deal with the crusaders. Venice itself would accompany them on crusade, not just transporting them, but actually the army of Venice and the major Venetians, including the Doge himself, would come on this crusade. But the Crusaders would have to help the Venetians out with a side project, conquering Zara, a port city in the Balkans near Venice that had recently rebelled from Venice's mini-commercial empire. Now, as you can imagine, this did not go over well. Zara was a fellow Latin Christian city, and the motive was entirely and obviously for the economic gain of Venice, not for the cause of Outremer. Pope Innocent III was furious, and he excommunicated both the Venetians and the Crusaders. He later relented on the Crusaders, but did not relent on the Venetians, at least not for a while. Now, the whole crusade in the aftermath of Zara was in danger of falling apart after having gone only a couple hundred miles. But it's at this moment that an exiled Byzantine prince showed up in Zara. He had lost in the nasty politics of Constantinople, where Alexios's dynasty had recently ended. Remember, Alexios was that Byzantine emperor who had asked for help from the West and thus accidentally initiated the First Crusade. That had led to a very powerful dynasty over the previous century, but it had collapsed very recently, and there was a civil war going on in Constantinople. This prince was an exile of one faction that had lost out in the civil war. Now, this exiled prince made absolutely outrageous promises to the Crusaders if they would just help put him back on the throne. He would, for instance, pay their debt to Venice. He would pay thousands of gold coins for the costs of the crusade outside what it was owed to Venice. He would pay for the upkeep of 500 knights in Jerusalem annually. He would end the Great Schism in favor of the Pope. In other words, this exiled Byzantine prince did what all exiles do: promise what they don't have. And the desperate Crusaders believed him. When the Fourth Crusade did show up at Constantinople, the then current emperor and rival of this Byzantine prince fled. But unfortunately, he fled with most of the treasury. He did have his priorities straight. And it quickly became clear that the enormous promises made to the Crusaders were going to be impossible to deliver. The Crusaders became increasingly unpopular with the locals in Constantinople, and riots broke out in the city. And a brief detail here is worth mentioning. It seems that some ordinary Crusaders, waiting around and frustrated by the detour and the delays, attacked a mosque in Constantinople. Now, you may ask, why did the Christian citadel of Constantinople have a mosque in the first place? Well, as I have said before, when we looked at the First Crusade, the Byzantine Greeks were tolerant and diplomatic with the Muslims. They had been living alongside Muslims for hundreds of years. They may have been enemies at points, but they knew they also had to trade with each other. They had to have some kind of relationship. And so there was constant Muslim trade in Constantinople, which benefited both sides. But of course, the Western Latin Crusaders had come all this way to kill Muslims, who they were not used to dealing with directly at all. The Greek Orthodox Christians, citizens of Constantinople, actually ended up coming to the defense of the Muslims against the Crusaders. A terrible irony, considering that the motivation for the First Crusade only a century before had been Crusaders coming to supposedly defend Constantinople from Muslims. In the aftermath of this incident, the Crusaders started a fire that ravaged Constantinople. Well, the Byzantines after this quickly overthrew the Crusaders as puppet emperor in response and told them to get out with no uncertain terms. Well, in danger of being forced to go home in humiliation, and in Venice's case, financial ruin, the Fourth Crusade instead besieged Constantinople, an act which Crusaders had been moving closer and closer towards for over a century of tension with the Byzantines. And against all odds, fewer than 20,000 Crusaders and Venetians managed to accomplish what no army in nearly 900 years had, what had foiled both Attila the Hun and generations of Muslim caliphs at the peak of their empire. The Fourth Crusade conquered Constantinople, the queen of cities, a city of 500,000 residents and the finest fortifications in the world. There were four major outcomes from this travesty of Christian disunity. First, the Crusaders looted Constantinople and liquidated 900 years of classical and medieval art and wealth and relics, shipping all of them back home to Western Europe. And I give you a few examples of these at the top of the slide that we're looking at right now. The best place, in fact, to see today what medieval Byzantium looked like is Venice, which is covered in looted Byzantine art, sculpture, and even architecture that was ripped out of the walls of various Byzantine buildings. All of Constantinople's many important relics were also looted. The city never fully recovered until its final conquest by the Turks a quarter of a millennium later, that we will look at the very end of this class. Second, the Crusaders set themselves up as the new emperors in Constantinople. They began what is often called the Latin Empire of Constantinople, because they saw themselves as the Latins as opposed to the Greeks. And they promptly set out to conquer the rest of the Byzantine Empire, creating a new set of Crusader principalities that, although never as popular, competed for resources with the originals in Outremer. So not only had the Fourth Crusade not helped, Outremer had never showed up there, it was now creating an alternative draw of Crusaders from Western Europe. Not nearly as successful, but enough to make a difference. Third, the unconquered parts of the Byzantine Empire. And remember, at first, the Crusaders only controlled the city of Constantinople itself. The unconquered parts of the Byzantine Empire splintered into competing factions, each of which wanted to retake Constantinople. And it was this competition between splinter empires of Byzantines that actually allowed the Crusaders in the Latin Empire a chance to dig in, just as Muslim disunity had allowed for the Crusaders to survive in the Holy Land. All Byzantines knew that without Constantinople they were not really emperors, and they could not let a rival claim this prize. It was therefore nearly 60 years before the Byzantines sorted themselves out and retook the city in 1261, effectively citing a civil war that they could ill afford. The Byzantines only finally retook Constantinople with, of all people, the help of the Venetians, by promising them and other Italians even more economic concessions than the Crusaders had. This reversed the pre-Fourth Crusade situation, when previously the Byzantines had been economically dominant over Venice. After 1261, Venice economically dominated the Byzantines. This was an even greater catastrophe than Manzikert for the Byzantines, destroying any hopes that Anatolia might eventually be recovered. Not only were the Byzantines never in a military position to reconquer the peninsula again, but they were no longer culturally impressive enough to hold off the gradual conversion of Anatolia to Turkey, which we will be looking at again later in a couple of lectures. Fourth and finally, this of course solidified the divisions of the Great Schism. The Greek Orthodox Eastern Christians would never truly trust the Western Latin Christians again after this betrayal, as they saw it, especially after the Crusaders, who once they took over, brutally suppressed the Greek church and imposed Latin Christianity in the region. Innocent III had decided to make the best of it and approved of the Fourth Crusade after the fact, seeing this as a way of de facto ending the schism in Rome's favor. But Greek Orthodox Christians began to think that perhaps even Muslim rule was better than rule by the hated Latin Christians and their crusaders, an attitude that would have far-reaching consequences in the end. The Fourth Crusade is nearly universally today seen as a tragedy, and people argue over who was to blame. The Venetians, and even Innocent III, often get blamed as schemers because in the end they perhaps benefited the most. I tend to fall in the camp that believes that we should look at this as a series of accidents and poor choices made by desperate people, predicated on centuries of mistrust between the Latin and Greek churches and a failure of cultural understanding. Well, in this first part of our lecture on the later Crusades, we've looked at the tragic consequences of Western and Eastern Christian divisions with the conquest of Constantinople. In the second part of this lecture, we're going to move forward with further Crusades, first looking at one of the unnumbered Crusades, the Albigensian Crusade, which took place entirely within Western Europe.